Hi! In this video we'll talk about the topic of gender and identity to prepare for the German Abitur. Now I'll tell you what, a lot of people do not like this topic very much, and some of my colleagues say, well, we're not really educated to teach this topic. But then I recently talked to a friend of mine who's not a teacher, and he said, well, you know what, talking about this would have helped me a lot more in my job in an office than talking about Shakespeare. So I accept that, and I think we need to deal with this topic, so let's go. I'll give you an overview about what exactly I'll talk about in this video. First of all, these key terms, sex and gender, need to be clearly differentiated so you know what the difference is and how to talk about it. We'll talk about some gender stereotypes that are common, about gender equality or inequality depending on your perspective. We'll talk about sexual orientations and gender identities, and about gender neutral language, and finish off with some discussion questions. Now remember, for the topic, for the content here in this context of the German Abitur, it's not so much to be an expert on this whole topic. You would need to study for that, but I think it's important to know the language, to have the language to express yourself, the vocabulary to talk about these topics, to know at least the main ideas. And it's more about being aware of these discussions than having a certain opinion. You need to create and form your own opinion, but you need to know these arguments if you're confronted with them so you can deal with them. Let's talk about these terms, gender and sex. And here English is very precise and clear, more so than German, I would say. You can already see the pictures up here show something about what this difference could be. And let's start with the term sex. Sex normally refers or has the categories male, female and intersex. And it's important here that this is something biological and physical that you can measure in a person. You can test them for it, or you can observe it as a scientist, as a doctor. These are chromosomes, for example, these are hormones, and this is of course your anatomy. Of course, as you can see up here in this illustration from a biology book, your reproductive anatomy, but also other aspects of your anatomy, like how much muscle mass you have, your bone shapes, and so forth. Important here is to note that this is assigned at birth. Basically, when you're born, a doctor will look at you and will say, okay, this is a male person, this is a female person, and in very rare cases, of course, intersex, so which means doesn't have all the typical characteristics of one sex or the other. Let's contrast that to the idea of gender. Gender, we have the categories of man, woman, or other categories. I don't want to go into detail on that at this point. But the important thing to remember is that this is a social and cultural construct. What is a social and cultural construct? That means something that is not biologically given, that doesn't exist as such on Earth, but that we have created as humans. To give you another example for a social construct, think of money. If you have a banknote, everybody will believe that it's worth something, which is why it is worth something, and you can buy something with it. But that doesn't mean that money as such, this piece of paper, is really to everybody everywhere worth something. And it's similar with these roles, with these gender roles, that everybody knows them, everybody knows about these ideas, even if they don't support this concept maybe, but they will know about it and everybody will refer to it, and so it will be self-reinforcing. We have different roles, behaviors and expectations that are associated with being a man or being a woman. For example, the role of a father or a brother is different from the role, a typical standardized role of a mother or a sister. As a teacher, you often expect boys and girls to act differently, to behave differently. And we expect different things from them in the lessons too. We expect, for example, maybe as teachers, that in languages women or females, girls will be better, and that in the science subject maybe boys will be better. It's important also to remember that because this is a construct, it is shaped by our culture, our specific culture in the country we live in, for example, and it's sort of a tradition, so it's within a family, it's handed down, this role of what it means to be a man or to be a woman. It's handed down from one generation to the next, which is also shows how difficult it is or would be to try to stop this kind of thing. And you personally, of course, can shape this too by showing to somebody else what you think a gender role should be or what it should not be. Let's move on to gender stereotypes, which is connected to this idea of gender, of course, and it's the very stereotypical things that we think about. This is a man, this is a woman, and I want to put them down here as such as stereotypes. A woman is supposed to be more emotional and sensitive than a man. We think, or people often think, they should prioritize family over career, and they are less capable in leadership roles and in the whole STEM field. So STEM is science, technology, engineering, math. So they're not that talented in that area. In contrast, a man should be strong and unemotional. They are natural leaders and providers, and more logical and less nurturing in their thinking and their actions. Now, if you look at this, your first reaction probably will be to start to think of, is that true or is that not true? And that is maybe not the most important point. You could argue forever how much of this is socially constructed and how much of it is linked to some biological qualities that males and females really do have. But the point is, if you really stick to these gender stereotypes very strongly, it's a form of discrimination. You will look at a girl and at a woman and think that she will be less capable in a leadership role or in the STEM fields. You will look at a man and think that he's not emotional responsive and that he's not nurturing and cannot care for, let's say, children. And this will limit people's freedom severely, and this is why it's a form of discrimination and should be stopped. Let's look at gender equality or gender inequality depending on the perspective. And I'd like to only give some examples here, and don't want to go into too much detail, where we can see that progress has been made but is by no means complete. Let's look at the right to vote, for example. Obviously, women have gained the right to vote in many countries. It's crazy to think that this is a relatively recent development. 100 years ago, this wasn't the case in most countries. But today, women are still don't have the same power in politics as men. And not only in politics, also in other leadership roles, of course, but here the point is in politics. Let's look at laws and legal protection. Now, there are laws now that protect against gender-based discrimination. So basically, you're not allowed to simply not accept somebody for a job explicitly because they are a man or a woman. This is not allowed. But of course, if something is not allowed, it doesn't mean that nobody does it anymore. So we still have a gender pay gap for several reasons. Also because the jobs that women traditionally do are often paid less, and of course also sometimes because doing the same job a woman actually does get less money for it and is promoted less than a male counterpart. Also, there is still the expectations that women will do some unpaid labor, for example, in the family or even at work. Then gender representation and norms in our society. There is an achievement. We do have more women in leadership roles in many companies. We do have politicians like Angela Merkel who are very, very successful leading big countries. So there has been development in that field, but there are still biases that sort of stop and hinder this development. It's still more difficult for women to get to the same point. And we still have things like sexual harassment that women much more often have to deal with than men. Now, when I talked about sex versus gender, I said that there is more to it than just male and female or man and woman. I'd like to go into detail on that a little bit here at this point. Now, this term LGBTQIA+ has developed from being shorter, from being LGBTQ, to include more gender identities. And let's start with the sexual orientations and then move on to the gender identities. We have lesbian, gay, bisexual, queer, asexual, and then we come to the gender identities. Remember the difference between the terms gender and sex. and here we have transgender and intersex, and then the plus exists simply to show that often this is a spectrum and it's difficult to say A or B, and sometimes you need a point somewhere in the middle, or there might be complete other identities that are not listed in these letters. A nice illustration that sort of helps understand the complexity of this topic is the genderbread person that a colleague suggested to me. It's of course a pun on gingerbread man that you can eat, and the genderbread person shows the complexity of this topic. So the brain represents identity. When you think of yourself, what kind of gender identity do you think of? Do you think you're a woman or a man, or maybe neither? Maybe it's not on that scale at all. Then there's gender expression towards the outside. What do people see? Do they see a person that dresses like in a feminine way or in a masculine way and expresses that, or does not and tries to avoid gender expression in their clothes? And from your anatomy, you can be either male or female, but of course you could be could have different qualities from different sexes, and you could be somewhere on a scale there too. And your attraction, the heart symbolizes attraction. You could be attracted to males or females, or you could not be attracted to anybody at all. So quite complex, and I think this illustration will help you to understand the different levels that this debate and identity is based on. Now, there is gender-neutral language, and attempts have been made to spread that more in the past. And this topic is extremely controversial. Some people will go crazy about it because they support it. Some people will go crazy because they are against it. Let's try to talk about this in a calm way. And I think it's good when I talk about the main concepts of this idea of gender-neutral language to consider that you could be for or against this for specific reasons. But I think it's important to know what is asked in the first place. What is the idea that gender-neutral language has? Let's start with one point. The idea is to eliminate gender terms in professional and public communication, so not restrict private communication everywhere, but public professional. So that, for example, the government could talk about a police officer rather than talking about a policeman. Also, the pronouns could be used to express that everybody is meant. For example, they, them in the singular. So in a sentence like, if a student has lost his or her textbook, you will say his or her and refer to this gender identity. You could simply say, if a student has lost their textbook, also in the singular, to avoid making this gendered choice. By the way, I've made a video on gender-neutral language in English that you can watch also. Then the idea is to avoid unnecessary gender distinctions. For example, when people say ladies and gentlemen, why not say everybody, and why limit it to these two choices? Then it asks for inclusive language in laws and policies, so that simply if you have a form, there's not only a box male or female to tick, but that there are some way to represent other options. Also, and this is particularly interesting if you speak a language different than English, how about gendered grammar? What do you do with that? The only contact that English has with that are very few words. For example, the word Latino is a word that is usually used to show that somebody is from Latin America. And here, of course, you would have to say she's Latina or he's Latino. And to avoid this, people have suggested saying something like Latinx. And of course, as a German, this is very clear how this can be a problem. Like in German, when we build the plural, traditionally you use the male form, but that is now very much under discussion, and people are trying to change it to use gender-neutral forms. Simply remember this topic, this is what is asked, what people suggest that you should do, and there are reasons for and against that you can and should consider. If you want to practice and prepare for this topic, I think it's a great idea to discuss this with a couple of people. You could also do this in a written way, which would help you with your vocabulary, but I've got some discussion questions here that you could use. For example, how does society influence the way individuals express their identity and gender? Remember, we talked about gender, the term gender, and stereotypes, which influences this here. Can true gender equality ever be achieved? Why or why not? Remember how I talked about achievements in gender equality versus the inequality that still remains. Or, what role does media play in challenging or reinforcing gender norms? Which examples can you think of? Again, with the stereotypes about genders, think for example about the last films that you watched. How did they reinforce or maybe deconstruct one of these stereotypes? Should transgender women compete in women's sport? Very controversial topic at the moment with very good reasons in both directions. Should gender-neutral language be encouraged and in official and professional settings, as said before? Also very controversial topics with very many good arguments for and against. I hope this video has helped you understand this broad topic a little bit more. I have other videos on a number of different topics. Please check on my channel. I hope I'll see you again here soon. Have a great day. Goodbye.
English with Mr. B.